The house fell silent after the loss, until a cat broke the void. The last of the sympathy cards had begun to gather dust on the mantelpiece. 3 months had passed since Evelyn Pierce had been moved to Oak Ridge Care Center, but to Harland, it might as well have been yesterday. The doctors called it progressive dementia, but all he knew was that his wife of 42 years now looked at him with the polite confusion reserved for strangers. Some days, she didn't look at him at all. Hartford, Connecticut wore the gray pallor of late autumn, as Harland stood at his kitchen window, staring at nothing in particular. At 68, he had become as much of a fixture in this house as the grandfather clock in the hallway. Present, functioning, but barely noticed. The clock at least served a purpose. Harland wasn't sure he did anymore. He stirred his coffee absently, though it had long gone cold. The kitchen was spotless, not from care but from disuse. Since Evelyn's departure, he had developed a routine that required minimal effort. Wake at 6, make coffee, toast a single piece of bread, sit at the table and stare at the chair where his wife should be. The rest of the day stretched before him like an empty highway. The 2-story colonial on Maple Street had once vibrated with life. Evelyn's piano playing, Sunday dinners with their son Michael and his family, neighborhood gatherings on the wraparound porch. Now Harland moved through the rooms like a ghost, leaving lights off, curtains drawn. The piano in the living room remained covered with a bedsheet, a silent monument to what had been lost. No point in pretending, he muttered to himself, a habit that had grown more pronounced with each passing day of solitude. This is how it is now. His cell phone rang. Harland glanced at the screen. Michael again. He silenced it without answering, as he had done for weeks. What was there to say? That he was fine, that life goes on. Lies seemed worse than silence. His son would eventually stop trying, and that would be easier for everyone. The doorbell rang, an intrusion so unexpected that Harland actually flinched. He hadn't heard that sound in weeks. Reluctantly, he shuffled to the front door, prepared to dismiss whatever well-meaning neighbor or persistent salesperson had decided to disturb him. Through the peephole, he saw nothing. Irritated, he cracked open the door, the hinges protesting from lack of use. No person stood on his porch, but a movement near his feet caught his eye. A slate-gray cat sat on his doormat, looking up at him with unblinking amber eyes. Not a kitten, but not old either, perhaps 2 or 3 years, with a sleek coat and ears that twitched slightly as it regarded him. It wasn't wearing a collar. "Get out of here," Harland said, his voice rough from disuse. "Go on." The cat didn't budge. It simply stared at him with an intensity that was almost unnerving, as though it had come to his door for a specific purpose. "I don't have anything for you," Harland insisted. "There's nothing here." He closed the door firmly, returning to his cold coffee and empty kitchen. But the image of those amber eyes stayed with him, like an accusation. The following morning, the cat was there again, sitting in the exact same spot. This time it had brought something, a small dried rosebud placed precisely on the welcome mat. Harland stared at it, his throat suddenly tight. Evelyn's roses. The garden she had tended so lovingly now lay neglected, the bushes wild and overgrown. But somehow this cat had found one last bloom. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The cat blinked slowly, then slipped past him into the house before he could stop it. Harland watched, too stunned to protest, as the animal walked directly to the living room and jumped onto the covered piano bench. It placed one paw on the sheet, looking back at Harland expectantly. "No," he said, finding his voice. "That's not for you. That's not for anyone anymore." He approached the piano, intending to remove the intruder, but hesitated when the cat gently placed its paw on the covered keys. Something about the gesture seemed too deliberate, too knowing. "You need to leave," Harland insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. The cat remained immovable as a statue, those amber eyes fixed on him. Harland felt exposed, as though this creature could see through the walls he had built around himself. "Fine," he conceded after a long moment. "One day. Then you're out." He retreated to the kitchen, leaving the cat where it sat. Throughout the day, he was acutely aware of its presence, moving from room to room, examining his home with quiet curiosity. It didn't make a mess or cause trouble. It simply observed, occasionally stopping to gaze at Harland with those penetrating eyes. By evening, Harland found himself filling a small dish with water, placing it hesitantly on the floor. The cat approached, drank delicately, then rubbed briefly against his ankle before returning to the piano bench. "You need a name if you're staying the night," Harlan said, surprising himself. "Can't just call you Cat." Now the animal's ears perked up as if in agreement. "Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow." Harlan studied it thoughtfully. "Quill," he decided finally. "You'll be Quill. Like a pen that could write a new story," he thought but didn't say aloud. "Like something small that makes its mark." That night, for the first time in months, Harlan slept without the television on, lulled by the gentle sound of Quill purring at the foot of his bed. And when he woke in the morning, he felt something unfamiliar, a small, almost imperceptible shift, as if something frozen had begun ever so slightly to thaw. But as he made his way downstairs, the sight of Evelyn's collection of ceramic birds on the shelf brought reality crashing back. What was he doing? Letting a stray animal into their home? Evelyn might never come back to this house, but that didn't mean he should change things. Preserving what had been was all he had left. He found Quill sitting by the front door, as if sensing Harlan's change of heart. "It's better this way," Harlan said, opening the door. "For both of us." Quill stepped outside but turned back to look at him one last time. Those amber eyes seemed to hold a question, or perhaps a promise. "I'll be back." And despite himself, Harlan felt both dread and hope at the prospect. As he closed the door, the silence of the house seemed even heavier than before. Harlan stood motionless in the hallway, listening to the emptiness, wondering if he had just made a terrible mistake or narrowly avoided one. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking time in a house where nothing changed. But for the first time in months, Harlan found himself wondering what tomorrow might bring. 3 days passed before Harlan saw Quill again. 3 days of the familiar silence, of meals eaten standing at the kitchen counter, of avoiding the piano room altogether. He had begun to convince himself that the cat had been a brief anomaly, a strange interruption in the carefully maintained stillness of his life. He was wrong. On the 4th morning, as rain pelted against the windows and wind howled through the oak trees lining Maple Street, Harlan found Quill huddled beneath the overhang of the front porch. The cat's normally sleek fur was damp at the edges, and it shivered slightly in the autumn chill. "Stubborn thing, aren't you?" Harlan muttered, but he opened the door wider. Quill entered with dignity despite being wet, careful not to brush against any furniture as he made his way to the kitchen. There he sat expectantly by the refrigerator, amber eyes fixed on Harlan. "I suppose you want breakfast?" Harlan said, surprised to find himself opening a can of tuna he'd had in the pantry for months. He placed a small portion on a saucer, then watched as Quill ate with delicate precision. The rain continued all day, transforming the world outside into a blur of greys and muted greens. Harlan found himself talking intermittently to Quill, small inconsequential comments about the weather, the news on the radio, even memories that surfaced unexpectedly. The cat listened with apparent interest, sometimes blinking slowly in response, sometimes tilting his head as if considering Harlan's words. When evening fell, bringing with it a deeper chill, Harlan reluctantly turned on the heat for the first time that season. He'd been avoiding it, partly to save money, but mostly because the sound of the furnace kicking on had always prompted Evelyn to say, "Winter's coming. Time to get cozy." Without her there to say it, the familiar sound felt like a mockery. Quill seemed to sense his discomfort, appearing at his side and pressing gently against his leg. The small weight and warmth were oddly comforting. "You don't understand," Harlan told the cat. "None of this matters anymore." But as he spoke the words aloud, they felt less true than they had when they lived only in his mind. Quill's amber gaze held no judgment, only patient attention. Harlan found himself wondering, not for the first time, what strange twist of fate had brought this particular cat to his door. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Harlan woke earlier than usual, roused by unfamiliar sounds from downstairs. He found Quill in the living room, somehow managing to knock a stack of old sheet music from a bookshelf to the floor. "What are you doing?" Harlan demanded, bending stiffly to gather the scattered papers. As he collected them, he realized these were Evelyn's favorites. Bach, Chopin, and the simpler pieces she had used to teach neighborhood children years ago. He hadn't looked at them since before her diagnosis, when her fingers had begun to miss notes she'd played flawlessly for decades. The first sign that something was wrong. Quill sat beside the piano, one paw resting on the edge of the sheet that still covered it. The cat's intent was unmistakable. "No," Harlan said firmly. "That stays covered." But Quill merely blinked at him, then stretched up to place both front paws on the edge of the bench. "I said no!" Harlan's voice was sharper than intended, echoing in the quiet room. Quill didn't flinch, didn't retreat. Instead, with deliberate slowness, he jumped onto the bench and then onto the covered keyboard. The weight of his body pressed down several keys at once, producing a muffled, discordant sound through the sheet. Harlan felt a flash of anger. "Get down from there right now!" The cat held his ground, amber eyes locked on Harlan's. Then, with exquisite precision, Quill stepped on a single key, producing one clear note that seemed to vibrate in the silent house. The anger drained from Harlan as quickly as it had come, replaced by a weariness that seemed to settle in his very bones. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. In response, Quill pressed the same key again, the note hanging in the air between them like a question. Harlan approached the piano slowly, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. With hands that trembled slightly, he grasped the edge of the sheet and pulled it away, revealing the polished walnut surface beneath. Dust had settled on the lid and keys, a visible reminder of neglect. Quill jumped down, allowing Harlan to sit on the bench. It felt foreign, this seat that had so often been Evelyn's place. He placed his fingers on the keys but didn't press them, couldn't bring himself to break the silence with his own clumsy attempts. "I never played," he told Quill, who sat attentively beside the bench. "That was her thing. I just listened." But the cat nudged his leg insistently, and almost without conscious thought, Harlan pressed a single key, C, the beginning of everything in music, as Evelyn had once explained. The note rang out, clear and perfect, filling the room with its presence. Harlan's chest tightened. He withdrew his hand quickly, as if burned. "That's enough for now," he said, voice rough. But he didn't replace the sheet. And later that day, he found himself wiping the dust from the piano's surface with a soft cloth, Quill watching from nearby with what almost looked like approval. That evening, the doorbell rang again, a rarity that had now occurred twice in 1 week. Harlan opened it to find Mrs. Chen from next door, a manila envelope in her hands. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Pierce," she said, "but this was delivered to my house by mistake." She glanced past him into the hallway, where Quill sat observing the exchange. "Oh, I didn't know you had a cat." "I don't," Harlan said automatically, then corrected himself. "That is, he's just visiting." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Well, he's beautiful. I haven't seen you out in the garden lately. Those roses of Evelyn's must miss your attention." The mention of Evelyn's name from someone else's lips felt like a physical blow. Harlan took the envelope, thanked her curtly, and closed the door before she could say more. He stood in the hallway, envelope forgotten in his hand, suddenly aware of how completely he had cut himself off from the world outside. The neighbors, the garden, even his own son, all kept at bay while he wrapped himself in silence. Quill approached, rubbing against his legs in a gesture that felt like understanding. "It's not that simple," Harlan told him. But that night, for the first time in months, he didn't immediately draw the curtains when darkness fell. Instead, he sat by the window, Quill curled in his lap, and watched as lights came on in neighboring houses, glimpsing lives continuing all around him. And when his phone rang and Michael's name appeared on the screen, he let his finger hover over the answer button longer than usual before letting it go to voicemail. It wasn't much, a moment's hesitation, a curtain left open. But as he finally rose to go to bed, Quill following at his heels, Harlan felt a strange sensation in his chest, a lightness, a loosening of something that had been tightly bound for too long. In the darkness of his bedroom, with Quill's warm weight settled at the foot of the bed, Harlan whispered, "Maybe tomorrow." He wasn't sure what he meant by it, what promise he was making to himself, or the cat, or the silence. But the words hung in the air like the piano note from earlier, a small tentative sound breaking through the quiet, a possibility where before there had been none. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the window. But inside, for the first time in months, the silence no longer felt absolute. The envelope from Mrs. Chen contained a notice from the Maple Street Homeowners Association, a formal complaint about the unkempt state of Harlan's front garden and a reminder of community standards. 6 months ago, such a letter would have infuriated him. Today, it merely confirmed what he already knew. Life had stopped for him, but the world continued to have expectations. He stood at the front window, coffee in hand, surveying what had once been Evelyn's pride. The rose bushes were indeed overgrown, their branches reaching in all directions like desperate fingers. Weeds had claimed the flower beds, and fallen leaves carpeted what remained of the lawn. It was, objectively, a mess. "They're not wrong," he admitted to Quill, who sat on the windowsill beside him, tail twitching occasionally. The cat jumped down and padded to the front door, looking back expectantly. Harland hesitated. He hadn't set foot in the garden since July, when the heat and his own indifference had combined to end any pretense of maintenance. "Fine," he sighed, reaching for his jacket. "But I'm just looking, that's all." The October air bit at his face as he stepped onto the porch, sharper than he remembered. Quill darted past him, weaving through the tall grass and disappearing beneath a hydrangea bush that had seen better days. Harland descended the steps slowly, feeling like a trespasser in what had once been his and Evelyn's shared domain. The garden had been her creation, but its upkeep had been a joint effort. She directed, he executed, and together they sat on the porch swing afterward, admiring their work with glasses of iced tea in summer or hot cider in fall. Now walking the perimeter of what remained, Harland felt a complex mixture of emotions. Guilt at having abandoned it, sadness at seeing Evelyn's vision so diminished, and an unexpected spark of something like resolve. Quill emerged from beneath the hydrangea with something in his mouth. He approached Harland and dropped his prize at the man's feet, a garden glove, caked with dirt, but still recognizable as Evelyn's, her name written on the cuff in faded marker. Harland picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was small like she had been, the fingers stiff with age and disuse. How many bulbs had these gloves planted? How many weeds had they pulled? How many roses had they carefully tended? "I can't do this," he told Quill, his voice catching. "Not without her." Quill simply stared at him with those unblinking amber eyes, then turned and walked deliberately to the garden shed. He sat before its weathered door, tail wrapped neatly around his paws. Harland felt almost manipulated. "You're just a cat," he said. "You don't understand what this means." But even as he spoke, he found himself following, unlocking the padlock that secured the shed. The door creaked open to reveal a time capsule, tools hanging neatly on their hooks, bags of fertilizer and mulch stacked in corners, Evelyn's wide-brimmed gardening hat on a peg by the door, everything exactly as it had been left, waiting patiently for gardeners who never returned. Quill slipped inside, investigating every corner with feline curiosity. Harland remained in the doorway, overwhelmed by the preserved tableau of their former life. He was about to retreat when the cat emerged from behind a stack of pots, batting something along the floor toward him. Seeds, a packet of Evelyn's favorite autumn flowers, chrysanthemums, deep gold like sunset. The packet was old, probably from last year's planting, but Harland picked it up, reading the familiar instructions on the back. "It's too late in the season," he told Quill. "These won't grow now." The cat merely blinked, then returned to exploring the shed. Harland stood holding the seed packet, feeling its slight weight in his palm. Too late for this season, yes, but next spring. The thought startled him. He hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead in months. His world had contracted to the immediate present. Today's meals, tonight's empty hours, tomorrow's identical routine. The idea of planning for a season that was months away felt both foreign and frighteningly optimistic. He was still standing there, contemplating the seed packet when a voice called from the driveway. "Dad, are you out here?" Michael. His son's tall figure approached through the garden, face etched with concern and surprise. "I've been calling you for days," he said as he drew closer. "When you didn't answer, I thought—" He trailed off, relief and lingering worry evident in his expression. Harland pocketed the seed packet, suddenly self-conscious. "I've been busy," he said, the lie transparent even to his own ears. Michael's gaze took in the neglected garden, the open shed, his father's defensive posture. "Right," he said gently. Then his attention shifted to Quill, who had emerged from the shed to inspect this new arrival. "Since when do you have a cat?" "I don't," Harland said automatically. "He just showed up." "He looks settled to me," Michael observed as Quill wound around Harland's ankles. "Does he have a name?" Harland hesitated. "Quill," he admitted finally. Michael's eyebrows rose slightly, but he only nodded. "Good name." He gestured toward the house. "Can we talk inside? It's getting cold out here." In the kitchen, the awkwardness between them was palpable. Michael declined coffee but sat at the table, watching as his father moved stiffly around the familiar space. Quill jumped onto an empty chair, observing their interaction with apparent interest. "How's Mom?" Michael asked finally. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Harland busied himself with the coffee pot, back turned to his son. "The same," he answered after a long moment. "Sometimes she knows me, sometimes she doesn't." He didn't add that his visits had become less frequent, that sitting beside her while she stared vacantly out the window or confused him with her long-dead brother had become a torture he couldn't bear. Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And how are you, Dad?" "Really?" Harland's instinct was to deflect, to offer the practiced response that kept everyone at a safe distance. "I'm fine. I'm managing." But as he looked at his son's worried face, at Quill watching attentively from his perch, something shifted. "Not good," he admitted quietly. "I haven't been good." The confession hung between them, raw and honest, in a way their conversations hadn't been since Evelyn's diagnosis. Michael reached across the table, briefly touching his father's hand. "I know," he said simply. "That's why I've been trying to reach you. We're worried. Lisa, the kids, me. You don't have to do this alone, Dad." Harland felt a familiar tightening in his throat, the precursor to tears he had refused to shed for months. He fought it back, focusing instead on the practical. "The Homeowners Association sent a notice about the garden," he said, nodding toward the envelope on the counter. "Apparently I'm bringing down property values." Michael smiled slightly. "I'm sure they said it much more diplomatically than that." "Not by much," Harland replied, and was surprised to find his lips quirking upward in response, the ghost of a smile he had thought forgotten. "I could help you with it," Michael offered. "This weekend, maybe? Emma's been asking to see her grandpa anyway. She could help plant something for fall, pumpkins or those mums Mum always liked." The mention of Evelyn, Mom, no longer felt like a blow. Instead, it conjured her image in a sun hat, directing their granddaughter where to place bulbs for spring flowers. A memory, but not a crushing one. "Maybe," Harland said, not committing but not refusing either. "I'd have to see what tools are still usable." Michael seemed to understand the significance of this small concession. He nodded, then changed the subject to safer territory. His work, Emma's soccer team, the upcoming town festival. Harland listened, offering occasional comments, aware that this was the longest conversation they had had in months. When Michael finally rose to leave, he hesitated in the hallway. "Lisa's making pot roast on Sunday," he said casually. "Your favorite. We'd love it if you came over." The invitation hung in the air. A bridge extended across the chasm Harland had allowed to widen between them. His instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of solitude. But Quill chose that moment to brush against his legs, a warm reminder of another presence in his life, another break in the silence he had cultivated. "I'll think about it," he promised, which was more than he would have offered a week ago. After Michael left, Harland found himself standing before the piano again, Quill at his side. With tentative fingers he pressed a key, then another, producing a simple two-note sequence that Evelyn had often played as the beginning of a more complex piece. The notes resonated in the room, neither beautiful nor accomplished, but present, a sound where there had been none. Quill jumped onto the bench beside him, amber eyes attentive. "I don't know how to play," Harland told the cat. "I never learned." But he pressed the keys again anyway, adding a third note this time, and as the sound filled the room, he realized that perhaps learning was still possible, not just music, but how to live in a world that had changed irrevocably, how to find a new rhythm when the old melody had been lost. That night, before bed, Harland did something he had been avoiding for months. He called Oak Ridge Care Center. "I'd like to visit Mrs. Pierce tomorrow," he told the night nurse. "In the morning, if that's a good time." The nurse's surprise was evident even through the phone. "Of course, Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Pierce is usually most alert in the mornings. She'll be happy to see you." Harland wasn't so sure about that, but as he hung up, he felt a weight shift slightly, not disappearing, but redistributing itself, becoming somehow more bearable. He glanced at Quill, curled at the foot of his bed. "One step at a time," he said, more to himself than to the cat. But Quill's ears twitched in response, as if in agreement with a plan that was only beginning to take shape. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the neglected garden. But for the first time in a long time, Harland fell asleep thinking not of what he had lost, but of what might still remain. Seeds waiting for spring, music unplayed but possible, connections frayed but not broken, small things, fragile things, but things that with care might yet grow again. Oak Ridge Care Center smelled of disinfectant and artificial air freshener, a combination that never quite masked the underlying sense of medical equipment and institutional food. Harland had come to dread this smell over the past months, but today he forced himself past it, clutching a small bouquet of store-bought chrysanthemums, the closest he could find to the ones Evelyn had loved to grow. The nurse at the reception desk smiled in recognition. "Mr. Pierce, it's been a while." "Mrs. Pierce is in the sunroom this morning." He nodded his thanks, trying not to feel the judgment in her words. It had been 3 weeks since his last visit, the longest gap since Evelyn's admission. The guilt sat heavy on his shoulders as he walked the familiar corridor to the sunroom at the east end of the building. Evelyn sat in a wheelchair near the windows, a light blanket across her lap, despite the warmth of the room. Her silver hair had been neatly styled, and someone had applied a touch of lipstick, but these details only emphasized how much had changed. She had always been small, but now she seemed diminished, reduced by the disease that was gradually erasing her. "Evelyn," he said softly, approaching with the flowers extended like an offering, "I brought you something." She turned toward his voice, her eyes, still the same clear blue they had been when they met 50 years ago, focusing on his face. For a moment there was nothing, and Harland braced himself for the vacant stare that had become increasingly common, but then recognition dawned, her face lighting up in a smile that transported him back decades. "Harland," she said, her voice thin but certain. "You came." He swallowed hard, taking the seat beside her. "Of course I did. I brought you flowers." She accepted the bouquet, touching the petals with gentle fingers. "Chrysanthemums," she identified correctly. "Like in our garden." "That's right," he encouraged, hope flickering. This was a good day, one where the fog lifted, where fragments of their shared past were accessible to her. "I was in the garden yesterday. It needs some work." Evelyn nodded, arranging the flowers in her lap. "The roses need pruning in October," she said, the words emerging from somewhere deep in her memory. "And the hydrangeas should be cut back before first frost." "I know," Harland said, covering her hand with his own. "I'm going to take care of it." She looked at him then, a flash of her old sharpness cutting through the confusion. "You haven't been, though. You've let it go." The directness of the observation startled him. "Yes," he admitted, "I have, but I'm going to start again. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow." Evelyn seemed to consider this, her fingers stroking the chrysanthemum petals. "Good," she said finally. "The garden shouldn't die just because I'm not there." The words pierced him. He wanted to protest, to tell her that she wasn't dead, that this wasn't the end. But the truth was more complicated. The woman he had married was both here and not here, present in body, but increasingly absent in mind. The disease was taking her in increments, leaving him to grieve in installments. "I have a cat now," he said instead, changing the subject. "A grey one with amber eyes. He showed up at the door about a week ago." Interest sparked in Evelyn's expression. "What's his name?" "Quill," Harland replied. "Because he's like a pen, writing something new." He hadn't articulated this thought before, not even to himself, but the words felt right as he spoke them. Evelyn smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I like that. Is he friendly?" "Very. And stubborn. He keeps trying to get me to play the piano." Her eyebrows rose. "You? Play the piano?" A small laugh escaped her, the sound so familiar that Harland's chest ached with it. "Now that I'd like to see. I'm terrible," he confessed, "but I've been trying, just simple things." "You never wanted to learn before," Evelyn observed. "When I offered to teach you." Harland looked down at their joined hands, at the thin gold band still on her finger. "I know, I thought it was your thing. I was happy just listening." And now, he met her gaze, so clear in this moment that he could almost forget what was happening to her. "Now I wish I'd learned when you could teach me. I wish I'd done a lot of things differently." Evelyn squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "We all have regrets, Harland. The trick is not to let them stop you from what's still possible." The wisdom of her words, so characteristic of the woman she had been, still was in moments like these. brought unexpected tears to his eyes. He blinked them away, not wanting to waste this lucid time on sadness. They sat together for an hour, talking about safe topics: the garden, the neighbors, memories from decades ago that somehow remained when yesterday had vanished. Harland found himself relaxing into the rhythm of their conversation, almost able to forget where they were and why. But inevitably, the fog began to return. Evelyn's responses grew vaguer, her focus drifting. She began to call him by her brother's name, then didn't call him anything at all, her attention captured by the pattern of sunlight on the floor. The nurse approached gently. "Mrs. Pierce will be having lunch soon, and then her afternoon rest." Harland nodded, recognizing the dismissal. He rose, pressing a kiss to Evelyn's forehead. "I'll come back soon," he promised. She looked up at him, confusion clouding her eyes. "That would be nice," she said politely, the way one might respond to a friendly stranger. Walking to his car, Harland felt the familiar weight of grief settling back onto his shoulders, but today it was accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose that had been absent for months. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. "The garden shouldn't die just because I'm not there. What's still possible?" At home he found Quill waiting by the front door, amber eyes bright with what seemed like expectation. "She had a good day," Harland told him, bending to stroke the soft grey fur. "She remembered the garden. She liked your name." Quill rubbed against his hand, then led the way to the kitchen, where he sat pointedly by his empty food dish. Harland smiled slightly as he opened a can of the cat food he'd purchased yesterday, a concession to the fact that tuna wasn't a sustainable diet for his new companion. "Getting demanding, aren't you?" he remarked, but there was no real criticism in his tone. The cat's presence had filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged, providing structure and companionship when both had been sorely lacking. After Quill had eaten, Harland found himself drawn to the garden shed again. This time he went inside fully, taking inventory of what remained usable. Most of the tools were in good condition, having been properly cleaned and stored before their long abandonment. A bag of mulch had split, spilling its contents across the floor, and several plant pots had cracked from temperature fluctuations. But overall, the damage was minimal. Much could be salvaged, restored, put back into service. Harland emerged from the shed with pruning shears and heavy gloves. The rose bushes needed attention most urgently. Their wild growth threatened their survival through the coming winter. He approached the nearest bush, studying its tangled branches with uncertainty. Evelyn had always handled the roses, claiming they required a special touch he lacked. "I might kill them," he told Quill, who had followed him outside and now sat watching from a safe distance. But the alternative, letting them die from neglect, seemed worse. So he began, carefully at first, then with growing confidence as muscle memory returned. Clip, remove, shape, create space for air and light, cut away the dead to protect the living. The work was physical in a way Harland hadn't experienced in months. His back protested, his hands grew sore despite the gloves, but there was satisfaction in the effort, in seeing immediate results from his labor. One bush, then another, gradually tamed back into form. He was so absorbed that he didn't notice Michael's car pulling into the driveway until a small voice called out, "Grandpa!" Emma, his 8-year-old granddaughter, raced across the lawn, her dark braids bouncing with each step. She skidded to a halt when she spotted Quill, her eyes widening in delight. "You have a kitty!" she exclaimed, immediately dropping to her knees to extend a hand toward the cat. To Harland's surprise, Quill approached her without hesitation, sniffing her fingers before allowing her to stroke his sleek fur. "His name is Quill," Harland told her, setting down his shears and removing his gloves. "He showed up at my door about a week ago." "He's beautiful," Emma said reverently. "Can I play with him?" "If he wants to play," Harland replied. "He has his own ideas about things." Michael approached more slowly, taking in the partially pruned rose bushes with obvious surprise. "You've been busy," he observed, gesturing toward the garden. "Looks like you've made a good start." Harland felt oddly defensive, aware of how much remained to be done. "Just the basics," he said. "The roses needed attention before frost." Michael nodded. "Mom always said October was critical for them." He hesitated, then asked, "Did you visit her today?" "Yes," Harland confirmed, watching as Emma coaxed Quill into chasing a leaf she dragged along the ground. She was having a good day. She remembered the garden. Something like relief crossed Michael's features. "That's great, Dad." He glanced at his watch. "Listen, we were heading to Hammond Park for their fall festival. Emma's been talking about it all week. We thought maybe you'd like to come with us." Harlan's instinct was to refuse. Public gatherings had become anathema to him since Evelyn's illness, too many acquaintances asking well-meaning questions, too much forced cheerfulness. But before he could decline, Emma looked up from her play with Quill. "Please come, Grandpa," she urged. "They have apple cider donuts and hay rides and pumpkin painting, and a really big corn maze." Her enthusiasm was so genuine, her desire for his company so clear, that Harlan found his resistance weakening. "I should clean up first," he said, gesturing to his dirt-stained clothes and hands. "We can wait," Michael said quickly, before his father could change his mind. "Take your time." 20 minutes later, Harlan found himself in the passenger seat of Michael's SUV, heading toward Hammond Park at the edge of town. Emma chatted excitedly from the back seat, filling the silence that might otherwise have grown uncomfortable between father and son. "I'm going to paint my pumpkin like a cat," she declared. "Like Quill, gray with yellow eyes." "Amber," Harlan corrected gently. "His eyes are amber." Emma considered this. "That's like golden brown, right? I'll mix the paint to make it perfect." Hammond Park was crowded, families taking advantage of the crisp fall day to enjoy the festival. Harlan tensed as they parked, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd been in such a public setting. The thought of navigating through strangers, of potential conversations, felt overwhelming. Michael seemed to sense his discomfort. "We can stay as long or as short as you want," he said quietly. "Just say the word when you've had enough." Harlan nodded gratefully, then took a deep breath and opened the car door. One step at a time, he reminded himself. What's still possible? To his surprise, the festival proved less daunting than he'd feared. Most people were focused on their own families, paying little attention to an elderly man trailing behind his son and granddaughter. Those who did recognize him offered simple greetings rather than probing questions, seeming to understand intuitively that more would be unwelcome. Emma's enthusiasm was infectious. She insisted on buying him a cider donut. "They're the best, Grandpa. You have to try one." Then led him to the pumpkin painting station where she meticulously created her Quill-inspired masterpiece. Harlan found himself selecting a small pumpkin of his own, painting it with simple stripes that reminded him of the piano keys he'd begun to explore. "That's really cool," Emma said, studying his work with serious consideration. "It's like music, right?" "Yes," Harlan agreed, surprised and touched by her perception. Like music. As the afternoon progressed, he felt something unexpected, moments of genuine enjoyment breaking through the cloud of grief that had become his constant companion. Watching Emma's delight at the magic show, tasting apple cider that reminded him of autumn's past, exchanging occasional comments with Michael about changes to the park since they had last visited. Each small experience added up to something like normalcy, like living instead of merely existing. By the time they returned to the house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the partially restored garden. Emma insisted on saying goodbye to Quill, who appeared from somewhere in the yard as if summoned by her desire to see him. "Can I come visit him again?" she asked, stroking the cat's sleek fur. "Maybe help with the garden next time?" "I'd like that," Harlan said, and was surprised to find he meant it sincerely. The garden needs all the help it can get. After they left, Harlan stood on the porch, watching their car disappear down the street. The day had been full in a way he hadn't experienced in months. Physical work in the garden, the emotional complexities of visiting Evelyn, the unexpected social engagement of the festival. He felt tired, but it was a different kind of fatigue than the bone-deep weariness that had plagued him since Evelyn's departure. This was the healthy tiredness of actual living. Quill wound around his ankles, meowing insistently, until Harlan followed him inside. To his surprise, the cat led him directly to the piano, jumping onto the bench and looking at him expectantly. "Really? After the day we've had?" Harlan asked. But he sat down anyway, placing his fingers on the keys. Over the past week, he had begun to teach himself the most basic elements of piano playing, using an old beginner's book he'd found in the bench. His progress was halting, his technique non-existent, but there was satisfaction in producing recognizable sequences of notes, in creating sound where there had been silence. Tonight, he attempted Heart and Soul, a simple tune Evelyn had often played when teaching children their first duet. His fingers fumbled over the keys, the rhythm uneven, but the melody was discernible beneath the mistakes. Quill sat beside him on the bench, amber eyes focused on the moving fingers, as if studying the technique. When Harland finished the short piece, the cat placed one paw gently on his hand, as if in approval or encouragement. "I'm not very good," Harland told him, "but I'm trying." The words seemed to apply to more than just his piano playing. He was trying to care for the garden, to maintain his connection with Evelyn even as she slipped away, to rebuild the relationship with his son and granddaughter that his grief had damaged. Small efforts, imperfect ones, but efforts nonetheless. Later that evening, as he prepared for bed, Harland found the small pumpkin he had painted sitting on his dresser. Michael must have brought it in while he was saying goodbye to Emma. Next to it lay a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. He opened it to find a child's drawing, a grey cat with oversized amber eyes sitting beside a stick figure with white hair. Above it, in Emma's careful printing, Grandpa and Quill. Harland placed the drawing carefully on his nightstand, his throat tight with emotion. Quill jumped onto the bed, settling into what had become his usual spot at the foot, watching as Harland got under the covers. "It was a good day," Harland told the cat softly. "A different kind of day." As he drifted towards sleep, the various threads of the day wove together in his mind. Evelyn's brief clarity, the restored roses, Emma's laughter, the simple tune on the piano. None of it erased what had been lost, the grief that remained. But alongside that grief, almost imperceptibly, something new was growing. Not happiness exactly, but perhaps its precursor, possibility. Outside, a light rain began to fall, pattering against the window panes. Harland listened to its rhythm, to Quill's soft purring at his feet, and for the first time in months he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. 2 weeks later, Harland woke to the sound of sleet tapping against his bedroom window. November had arrived with biting winds and the promise of an early winter, but inside the house was warm, the thermostat now set at a comfortable level rather than the bare minimum he had allowed himself before Quill's arrival. He rolled over to find the cat already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. In the pale morning light, Quill's grey coat almost shimmered, giving him an otherworldly quality that made Harland smile. "You're looking particularly dignified this morning," he told the cat, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. "What's the occasion?" As if in answer, Quill jumped down and padded to the bedroom door, looking back expectantly. Harland followed, now accustomed to the cat's insistent guidance. In the kitchen he found the answer to Quill's unusual alertness. The calendar on the wall showed that today was Sunday, the day he had agreed, after much persuasion from Michael, to host a small Thanksgiving gathering. "That's not until afternoon," Harland reminded Quill, filling the coffee maker. "We have hours yet," but the reminder set a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. It had been nearly a year since he'd hosted anyone in this house. The last time had been Christmas, before Evelyn's condition had deteriorated to the point of requiring full-time care. The thought of filling these rooms with people again, of attempting to create a holiday atmosphere without her, still felt daunting. Yet he had agreed, partly because Emma had asked so earnestly, "Please, Grandpa, I want to show Mom your piano," and partly because he had begun to recognize the dangers of his self-imposed isolation. The past few weeks had shown him that connection, however painful, was necessary, like air and water, a requirement for life rather than a luxury. He spent the morning in methodical preparation, vacuuming, dusting, arranging the dining room table with the good dishes that had sat unused for months. Michael and Lisa would bring most of the food, but Harland had insisted on making Evelyn's cranberry relish, working from a recipe card in her neat handwriting that he'd found in the kitchen drawer. As he chopped the oranges and cranberries, the familiar scent brought a rush of memory. Evelyn in this same kitchen, laughing as she added an extra splash of orange liqueur to give it kick, her hair caught up in a loose bun, flour on her cheek from the pie crust she'd been rolling earlier. The recollection was vivid but no longer crippling. He could hold it now, acknowledge it without being consumed by it. Quill observed the preparations from various vantage points, the counter, the windowsill, the back of the sofa, his amber eyes tracking Harland's movements with apparent approval. When the doorbell rang at 1 o'clock, the cat was the first to reach the hallway, as if eager to greet the visitors. Michael, Lisa, and Emma arrived with arms full of covered dishes and a flurry of activity. Behind them came a surprise. Lisa's parents, Jim and Margaret, who had often joined them for holidays in the past. "Hope you don't mind the extras," Michael said, helping his father-in-law with his coat. "When we mentioned we were coming here, they asked if they could join." They've missed seeing you." Before Harland could process this, Emma rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Quill. "Hi, Kitty," she exclaimed. "I brought you something." She produced a small catnip mouse from her pocket, offering it to the cat with solemn ceremony. Quill accepted the gift graciously, batting it once before picking it up in his mouth and carrying it to his favorite spot beneath the piano bench. "He loves it," Emma declared confidently, beaming at her grandfather. "I'm sure he does," Harland agreed, touched by her thoughtfulness. The house, so long silent, quickly filled with sound, voices calling greetings, the clatter of dishes being arranged, Emma's running commentary as she gave her great-grandparents a tour of the recent changes. Lisa took charge in the kitchen, organizing the food with cheerful efficiency, while Michael and Jim discussed the football game that would start later. Margaret approached Harland as he stood somewhat overwhelmed in the midst of this sudden activity. "The garden looks wonderful, Harland," she said, gesturing toward the front windows where the pruned roses could be seen, properly mulched now for winter protection. "Evelyn would be so pleased." Once, the mention of what Evelyn would think might have felt like an accusation, a reminder of his failure to maintain what she had created. Now it felt like a genuine compliment, an acknowledgement of his efforts to honor her work. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's coming along." Margaret hesitated, then asked the question he had been bracing for. "Have you seen her recently? Michael mentioned she had a good day when you visited." "I've been going twice a week," Harland told her, surprised to realize how quickly this had become his new routine. "Some days are better than others, but she's comfortable. The staff takes good care of her." It wasn't the whole truth. The reality of Evelyn's decline was more complicated, more painful, but it was a version he could share, a way to acknowledge her condition without exposing the raw edges of his grief. Margaret seemed to understand. She squeezed his arm gently, then changed the subject to safer territory: the upcoming winter forecast, the church bazaar, Emma's recent science project. Harland found himself participating in the conversation with unexpected ease, the social muscles that had atrophied in isolation gradually reawakening. When they gathered around the table, the absence at Evelyn's usual place was noticeable, but not overwhelming. Michael had set an extra place, not in memorial but with practical purpose. "Mom's coming for dessert," he explained, seeing his father's questioning look. "The care center has a program where they bring residents out for holiday visits, if the family can provide transportation. I arranged it last week. I hope that's okay." Harland felt a complex surge of emotions: gratitude, anxiety, hope. "Of course," he managed, his voice slightly rough. That would be wonderful." The meal progressed with the comfortable rhythm of family gatherings, passing dishes, complimenting the food, sharing stories that ranged from recent events to long-ago memories. Harland found himself more engaged than he had expected, even contributing an anecdote about Quill's recent fascination with the bathroom faucet that drew laughter from everyone. Emma, seated beside him, kept up a steady stream of commentary, drawing him into her world of school projects, friend dynamics, and detailed opinions on everything from mashed potatoes, better with lumps, to the newest Disney film. Her uncomplicated acceptance of his presence in her life, her assumption that he would be interested in her thoughts, worked like a balm on his wounded spirit. As Lisa and Margaret cleared the dinner dishes, preparing for dessert and Evelyn's arrival, Harland found himself at the piano with Emma. She had asked to hear what he had learned, and despite his self-consciousness, he couldn't refuse her eager request. "I'm not very good," he warned, settling on the bench. "I've only been practicing for a few weeks." "That's okay," Emma assured him. "Mom says beginners should get extra applause for being brave." With that encouragement, Harland played the simple piece he had been working on. Für Elise, just the opening theme, played slowly and with careful attention to the notes. His fingers stumbled in a few places, but he completed the recognizable melody, looking up to find Emma watching with genuine appreciation. "That was really good, Grandpa," she declared. "Can you teach me how to play it?" Before he could respond, the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival he had both anticipated and dreaded. Michael went to answer it while Harland remained at the piano, suddenly uncertain. A moment later, Evelyn entered the living room, accompanied by a care center aide. She was in her wheelchair, a colorful afghan across her lap, her hair styled and a touch of makeup applied for the special occasion. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the gathered family, before coming to rest on Harland at the piano. A long moment passed as everyone waited to see if she would recognize him, recognize where she was. Then, slowly, her face transformed with a smile of such clarity and warmth that Harland felt his breath catch. "You're playing," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "After all these years, you're finally playing the piano." Something broke open in Harland's chest, not the shattering he had feared, but a release like ice giving way to spring thaw. "Just a little," he managed, blinking rapidly. "Nothing complicated." Evelyn's gaze took in the room. The family gathered, the table set with her dishes, the cat watching curiously from beneath the piano. "You've been busy," she observed, and in those simple words, Harland heard her recognition of all that had changed, all that he had struggled to rebuild in her absence. "We have a cat now," Emma announced, dropping to her knees beside Evelyn's wheelchair. "His name is Quill, and he's super smart. He helped Grandpa fix the garden and learn the piano." Evelyn reached out to stroke Emma's hair, a gesture so familiar that for a moment time seemed to fold in on itself. "Did he?" she asked, her eyes meeting Harland's over their granddaughter's head. "That sounds like quite a cat." As if aware of being discussed, Quill emerged from his spot beneath the piano, approaching Evelyn with dignified curiosity. He sniffed the wheels of her chair, then jumped lightly onto her lap, settling there as if they were old friends. "Oh!" Evelyn exclaimed softly, her hand automatically moving to stroke his sleek fur. "Hello there." The cat began to purr, the sound audible in the suddenly quiet room. Everyone watched the interaction with a sense of witnessing something significant, a meeting that seemed both ordinary and somehow profound. "He likes you," Harland said, moving to sit beside his wife's wheelchair. "He's a good judge of character." Evelyn's eyes, clear and present in this moment, held his. "You seem better," she said quietly, a statement rather than a question. "I am," Harland acknowledged. "Not all the way, not yet, but better." The afternoon unfolded with a gentleness Harland hadn't dared to hope for. Evelyn remained lucid throughout, enjoying pumpkin pie and coffee, listening to Emma's stories, accepting the affection of family members who had missed her. There were moments of confusion, names temporarily forgotten, questions repeated, but these were met with patient understanding rather than dismay. Throughout it all, Quill remained close to Evelyn, sometimes on her lap, sometimes at her feet, as if standing guard over this precious, temporary reunion. Harland found himself watching the cat with a sense of wonder, marveling at how this creature who had entered his life so unexpectedly had somehow helped create this moment, this gathering, this healing, this brief respite from the relentless progression of loss. When it was time for Evelyn to return to Oakridge, Harland walked her and the aide to the car. In the privacy of the driveway, with only the falling dusk as witness, he took her hands in his. "Thank you for coming," he said, the words inadequate for all he felt. Evelyn squeezed his fingers, her grip still surprisingly strong. "The house feels like home again," she told him. "You've brought it back to life." "Not me," Harland admitted. "Quill started it. Then Michael and Emma. They wouldn't let me stay hidden away." "Good," Evelyn said firmly. "That's not what I wanted for you." The statement struck him with its clarity of purpose, its acknowledgement of what they both knew but rarely spoke aloud, that her illness was creating a future in which he would continue without her physical presence. "Not yet, not entirely, but eventually." "I know," he said simply. "I'm trying to remember that." As the car pulled away, Harland felt the familiar ache of separation, but it was accompanied now by something else, a sense of continuity, of connection that persisted despite physical absence. He returned to the house, to the family that remained, carrying this feeling with him like a small flame against the gathering darkness. The evening concluded naturally, with dishes washed and leftovers divided, goodbyes exchanged, and promises made for future gatherings. As the last car pulled away, Harland stood on the porch with Quill beside him, watching the taillights disappear down the street. "We did it," he told the cat. "We had a holiday." Inside, the house felt different, not empty as it had for so many months, but resting, holding the echoes of conversation and laughter, waiting for the next occasion to be filled. Harland moved through the rooms, straightening a cushion here, adjusting a chair there, aware of Quill following his circuit. In the living room, he paused before the piano, remembering Evelyn's face when she had seen him playing. On impulse, he sat down, placing his fingers on the keys. The piece he had practiced came easily now, the simple melody flowing more smoothly than it had earlier. When he finished, He felt Quill's weight as the cat jumped onto the bench beside him. Those amber eyes, so inscrutable and yet so expressive, seemed to hold a question. "Yes," Harlan said, answering what hadn't been asked. "I'm going to be all right." And he knew with a certainty that had been absent for too long that it was true. Not because the pain had disappeared, it hadn't, and likely never would completely. Not because Evelyn's condition would improve, it wouldn't, and that reality remained a grief he carried daily, but because he had begun to learn what she had always known, that life continues, different but still valuable, even after profound loss. The garden would bloom again in spring, though he would need help to make it happen. Music would fill the house, imperfect but genuine. Family would gather around his table, bearing both love and the inevitable complications of human relationships. And through it all, a slate-grey cat with amber eyes would observe, nudge, demand comfort, an unlikely guide on this journey he hadn't chosen, but now accepted. Harlan stroked Quill's sleek fur, feeling the vibration of his purr beneath his fingers. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not giving up on me." Outside, the sleet had turned to snow, the first of the season, transforming the world with quiet persistence. Harlan watched the flakes descend, coating the garden he had reclaimed, the roses now sleeping beneath their winter mulch. In the stillness he felt a sense of completion, not of his journey, which would continue with all its challenges and uncertainties, but of a cycle that had begun with silence and now ended with sound. The house was no longer quiet. It contained music, memory, possibility, and in this moment that was enough. As if reading his thoughts, Quill pressed against his side, a warm presence in the gathering night. Together they sat, watching the snow fall, two beings who had found each other in the midst of solitude, creating something neither had expected but both now treasured, a harmony composed of notes both minor and major, a song that acknowledged sorrow but did not end with it. Outside, winter was just beginning, but inside, spring had already taken root, waiting patiently beneath the surface, ready to emerge when the time was right. And Harlan, no longer alone, was prepared to wait with it.